Thank you very much, Gil. Another tradition that we keep in our conference is our cooperation with the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. This year, as we are focused on remote sensing, we will have a review on the history of remote sensing. The review will be delivered by Dr. Mrtin Coliన్స్, who has already joined this conference in the past. Dr. Mrtin Coliన్స్ is a curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. He received his PhD in History, Science, Technology from the University of Maryland. His research focused on the history of the United States in the world after 1945, as seen through the history of technology. He serves as the editor of the Journal of History and Technology and is a managing editor of the book series Artifacts. Studied in History of Science and Technology, published by a Smithsonian Institute Scholarly Press, Dr. Coliన్స్' book Telephone for the World Motorola Iridium, and Making of Global Age will be published by Johns Hopkins University Press in April 2018. Dr. Coliన్స్, the floor is yours.
Well, I appreciate being invited here. And as you can see from my PowerPoint, I don't typically address industry or government audiences. It's exceedingly plain. It's interesting to be here. Dr. Pawlikowski asked me to do a kind of historical presentation in 10 minutes, which of course is an impossibility. So what I thought about in trying to kind of frame something that might be beneficial as a historian is to kind of take you in a kind of different frame of mind and get you to think about how the story that is being presented here today by the various speakers, all deeply active in this contemporary moment, how this will look 20 or 30 years from now and how we would potentially write that story. And it's obviously going to be something of a challenge, and so I want to kind of just walk through a few points that may help us kind of reorient ourselves. And it kind of, I think in a sense, some of the issues that I will raise were already presented by Dr. Werner, but with a slightly different spin from a historian's point of view. Let me see if I can get this right. You know, the world really in terms of remote sensing, and here I'm thinking particularly of visual imaging of the planet, really breaks down into two sort of periods. And as a historian, one always thinks in terms of chronology. Is one sort of set of years different than another set of years as you go through time? And certainly in the case of the United States, which has been a major player in this area since the inception of the space age, I've kind of highlighted a kind of a critical sort of moment, sort of as 1992, which was when the United States sort of switched its policy with respect to Landsat, primarily prompted by the success of the Spot satellite and French adventures into satellite imaging. Spot provided cheaper, higher resolution images and began a sort of a trend that sort of highlighted the commercial elements of satellite imaging. And that was sort of a crucial moment. So that's a kind of internal to the space world kind of development. But of course, as been alluded to already, this came at a time when there was a marked turn from state-centric ideas of how one would do space activity to ones that were more oriented to the marketplace. And this was not only a perspective that was prominent within the United States, but became quickly adopted sort of internationally and affected areas like telecommunications much more quickly than it did in satellite imaging. So the other aspect of this, of course, is that this was not only sort of related to the marketplace, but also to the information revolution. The kinds of issues that we were talking about today, we wouldn't be framing in the same way if there wasn't this coincidental historical development of information technologies and the radical way in which they have entered into our everyday lives. But of course, talking about sort of the historical moment back in the 1990s and even today also has to kind of pay attention to long-standing issues associated with the past. And even as you kind of look at our program and see particularly tomorrow, I think early in the program, is a look at issues of remote sensing as it applies to developing countries. This is a legacy that has been well in place since the end of World War II. As new nations sort of came into the family of nations, the UN was created, and one has this sort of enduring sort of historical set of factors that impact how we think about remote sensing and other kinds of space-based technologies today. I thought it would be useful to just share a kind of one sort of data point, a US-centric one. If you read this very, very bureaucratic language, you see the tension between a nation-state-centered perspective on remote sensing and that based on the marketplace, where the United States in 2003, as a kind of ramping up of capability to do satellite imaging became more widespread. How is one going to strike the balance between the nation-state and the marketplace? And I think this sort of issue, as outlined by Dr. Werner, of course, is still here today. This is really kind of the fundamental tension point within how we sort of understand the future development of this technology and its relationship to our daily lives. And I think the critical sort of factor here is that, you know, the nation state represents a kind of way to fundamentally control and organize and provide a kind of central force in thinking about this set of activities. But of course, the marketplace represents a completely contrary point of view for the most part, even when one thinks about potential collaboration between industry and nation states. And that is that the marketplace is just fundamentally more chaotic. There are more and chaotic in a productive, innovative way, but chaotic in the sense that one cannot easily predict sort of directions of development. And this sort of tension, as I say, you know, has continued to the present, and I think is kind of a core aspect. So as a historian, if I were thinking about, if I were writing this history 20 years from now, that would be a kind of focal point of how one would begin to kind of manage this incredible set of activities. I mean, what was just laid out initially this morning and what will be gone into greater depth in this panel and other panels will just show the remarkable wealth of activity touching many, many different sort of aspects of our life, whether it's in with the university, industry, governments, or in our day-to-day consumer lives. I wanted to kind of show this image from an Israeli firm. And this was presented, and it was shown probably in a trade publication in the mid-2000s. And it captures this kind of tension that was happening at that moment in time between the marketplace and the state. And certainly the desire by other nations who had not yet acquired space-based capabilities to kind of join in that exercise. Well, how would they be able to do it even if they couldn't launch their own satellite or have you know, strong participation in one? Well, they could do it via a proxy. In this case, it would be via Israel's well-developed capability by that point in time. So it is a kind of interesting sort of historical marker of how the field has developed and how rapidly it's changed even in just a decade. One can't read this crazy little graphic, but what it sort of highlights is through time how the number of countries participating in the very sort of specific activity of visual remote sensing has increased over time. So you have, as of 2015, as represented in this chart, approximately 35 countries. I'm sure that number is greater today, so we're looking at more than 20 and almost a 25% perhaps of the nations in the world being participants in this single activity alone. And if you look at it again, a thing you can't read from the back, again, this is how historians present stuff, is those countries that have very high resolution, 1 meter or better capability in commercial satellites. Again, the list is very long. Think back to that presidential directive from the United States that I shared with you, and you can see how the ability to kind of control this information, to kind of make it the property, if you will, of a single national entity, of course, begins to become impossible. There are just too many actors contributing with different motivations, different interests, and their relationships both to publics and to industrial interests. This was sort of touched on in Dr. Werner's talk, and I think it's kind of useful to think about this sort of element of how, as he put it, in situ activity happens. This is after the earthquake in Nepal, and a bunch of activists in Nepal using data, available image data, plus their own sort of ground truth, if you will, about how to respond to the Nepalese earthquake and how to assist on the ground. This highlights the importance not only, of course, of kind of crisis management and the use of space tools to contribute to recovery, but it shows the ways in which this activity is not just the activity of elites. These are, kind of geeks, if you will, but people who have the ability to kind of contribute, who are not necessarily kind of associated with the typical centers of expertise that we think about when we think about things like satellite imaging. The other thing that I think probably won't be touched on here is the way in which not only is kind of Earth-looking capability via satellite something that, of course, is an extremely powerful tool, but we have to kind of look at the possibilities potentially of if you will, it being a kind of communications vehicle as well, right? This is a drone image from Pakistan, a protest against the use of drones by the United States in Pakistan in some of the wars against Al-Qaeda there. As a way of saying that, of course, this activity was not only about national security issues, but also impacted lives on the ground. And this was one way of communicating that message in a very strong way, so that the imaging itself becomes a kind of communication tool, not merely a kind of data point in a larger structure of information. And I'm going to conclude by just thinking a little bit about this scene here. And the Anthropocene, I see, is not a word that sort of came up on the program, but of course it is, kind of fundamentally the story that goes with remote sensing. For those not familiar with the term, it's meant to identify this particular moment in Earth's time as one that is fundamentally shaped by human presence and human activity on the planet. We are collectively a physical force that is changing and characterizing what Earth is at this sort of moment in time. And that's a kind of critical concept. So when one thinks about remote sensing, of course it is in a peculiar position in this story. It is both a kind of recorder, helper, solver of problems associated with the human presence on the planet and its impact on the planet. But it also is, in a sense, has kind of changed the very definition of what is Earth, right? When we think about Earth, it's simply not the surface and the atmosphere going up and eventually attenuating into space, but it also now is that human infrastructure that has been created around the planet. That, too, is Earth. And I wanted to show this sort of, kind of put that in relationship to this image that came from Apollo 17 back in 1972. So that too is, of course, is a form of remote sensing, right? That we see the planet in this particular way, that we have through time, especially beginning in the 1960s, changed our own understanding of our relationship to the planet. We have shifted our consciousness about who we are and how we relate to the planet. And it is images like this and those that come from remote sensing that make that possible. And this is continuing, so we, not only are able to access, kind of Earth-based images on our smartphones, our tablets, our computers. Pretty soon we'll be able to not only get, kind of still images, but actual video of the planet on a near real-time basis, as represented by new initiatives like Planet Labs constellation that was kind of referenced earlier today as well. So I just kind of want to leave you with that thought that there's, these kinds of range of issues, that remote sensing itself, of course, may be becoming a term that is kind of slightly off kilter in a sense, that the remote part of that phrase is perhaps not quite how we describe where we are right now, right? We have sort of those kind of ground level truths, as was mentioned before, and as I highlighted in a couple images here, and we have this sort of deep change in consciousness that is just part of our outlook and our perspective now that really wasn't there, say, 30, 40, or even 50 years ago. So we have a very different place. So I'm happy as a historian to be wrong about all this. And in 20 or 30 years, we can kind of look back on this moment and ask, you know, what was important, what was really kind of shaping our outlook towards the future. And of course, if some of you here want to share your insights with me, I would be happy to have them. And thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to participate in the conference.